Hi, Frank.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm okay. How are you?
Cannot complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is a Nonzero podcast. You're Francis Fukuyama, very well-known political scientist. You're at Stanford University, author of a number of well-known books, probably none better known than The End of History and the Last Man, which we're going to talk about, but also a book called Trust, a book on the origins of political order, book on the decline of political order called Political Order and Political Decay, and other things. You've been busy. These are big books, big in the conceptual sense, and also some of them are physically large, especially these recent ones. So listen, Frank, I have to admit that I set this conversation up in a slightly self-indulgent spirit. One thing you and I have in common is that we've both written big think books about history and its direction. Yours, The End of History, and The Last Man. Mine, Nonzero, The Logic of Human Destiny, which came out at the turn of the millennium. Both of us sometimes...
One of my favorite books, by the way.
Oh, I'll bet you say that to all the podcast hosts. You did actually, you reviewed it favorably for the Wilson Quarterly. I don't know if you remember, but that was very kind of you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. So is yours. So, the other thing we have in common is that we both sometimes get accused of having gotten history wrong. You get accused more often than I do, but that's just because your book is better known, I think. I don't generally respond to these criticisms on a case-by-case basis. And I thought it would be nice at some point to sit down and respond, but it would be a little too self-indulgent, even by my standards, to just sit there alone on my podcast and take on my critics. So I thought, well, why don't I get Frank, and we can both do that and console one another and so on. And also compare and contrast our arguments, maybe, because there are interesting differences between them. And so why don't we start out with yours? I thought we could both kind of just start out by getting the basic arguments out there, the basic criticisms out there. Both of us deny that the criticisms have any validity whatsoever, or however we want to put it. And then do compare and contrast, and maybe even talk about the contemporary world. So your book was based on an essay that came out in, I think, 1989, called The End of History and the National Interest. Now, I was at the New Republic then. I very well remember the moment. The Cold War was ending. It seemed as if we had won, and your essay was about the fact that liberal democracy seemed to have, in some sense, triumphed over competing ideological systems. Fascism had kind of failed earlier in the century, and now, Marxism wasn't looking great. Is that? Why don't you take it from there? I mean, if I've gotten anything wrong, correct me, but then kind of elaborate to the extent that you want to.
Well, sure. So just to begin, actually, I think the definitive work that I've done on this broad scope history issue is actually not The End of History and the Last Man. It's this 2-volume work on political order. So it begins with the origins of political order from pre-human times to the French Revolution, and then the second volume takes that story up to the present. And in many ways, that 2-volume series is my attempt to rewrite The End of History, because there's a lot of things that I learned. I wrote The End of History when I was in my mid-30s, and I just learned a lot more, after that period. And so that's been incorporated into that 2-volume work. Among other things, history, in The End of History really kind of begins with the early modern period and the takeoff of modern economies and the technological revolutions that have happened since then. But I really didn't know a lot about the early history, and particularly, a subject that you have written a lot about, evolution, the whole field of evolutionary psychology, and the fact that human nature really spent a lot of time evolving in primates. And so the the 2-volume book really does begin with mankind's primate ancestors and the fact that their brains had evolved to be social creatures in certain very distinctive ways, and that this is a legacy, that human nature is a legacy that we carry forward with us. And the first volume of that series actually begins with primate organization, and then how that gets translated into the organization of hunter-gatherer societies, and hunter-gatherer societies then evolve into tribal societies, and the first states are formed. And so there's a lot of history that I didn't cover in the end of history. But I guess to cut to the more contemporary arguments, the question then is, does history, this modernization process, actually have a clear terminal point, or at least a point, where this modern synthesis seems to come together in a kind of stable whole? And I argue that that was liberal democracy tied to some kind of a market economy. And a lot of the arguments I've had and a lot of the criticisms that people have made subsequently really have to do with whether that's a stable endpoint and whether they're not alternatives and so forth. And I've been, I believe, fairly open-minded about this. I have all along for the last 3 decades said, China is really the only global civilization that really looks like it could produce something superior, in the sense that it's managed this incredible process of economic modernization. They've mastered a lot of dimensions of modern technology, which is really what's driving a lot of these changes. And they seem to be politically stable, and they're definitely not democratic.
And when you say superior, do you mean in terms of sheer kind of power and prosperity?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, unfortunately,
so a serious rival, in other words, to alternatives.
A serious rival. And the power dimension is more important than a lot of people would like to believe. I mean, I think that the normative evaluation of political orders is important, but quite frankly, a lot of what we accept as normatively right depends on your ability to maintain stability, to grow, to become economically and militarily powerful. And the Chinese are well on their way to, demonstrating that. And I've always said that while I think that there are reasons why their system isn't going to prevail in the end, I don't know that because I can't see in the future. I mean, a lot of people accuse me of being a futurologist or trying to make predictions about the future. That's never been my, objective. I'm just saying there are these long-term trends, and if they continue, we're going to go in one direction or another. And China is a, alternative that's out there.
Okay. And have you characterized the criticisms as much as you care to? I mean, it has to do. I mean, it seems to me the kind of crass version of the criticism is to point to a war somewhere and say, I thought you said everything was going to be wonderful. Yeah. Although actually, even in the essay itself, you weren't entirely happy with a world in which liberal democracy and market economics had prevailed. You kind of said it might be a little boring and maybe more materialistic than is optimal for true human flourishing. But anyway, you get that a lot, right? Just kind of pointing to bad things happening, as a rebuttal.
Yeah, well, my answer to that is the same. I mean, you have to look at history in a very long-term sweep and ask the question, has there been progress, and does modernization actually look like a coherent project? Actually, Polity did a series of essays critiquing my book, and this was actually on the part of people who had actually read the book, which is a good thing because many of my critics have actually not cracked the book at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, there are a lot of different approaches, but probably the dominant one, and the one I take the most seriously, is that actually liberal democracy itself is not a particularly stable endpoint. And that they're kind of, I said that the end of history will come when you have a society that has no big fundamental internal contradictions that then force it to evolve into something different. And, a lot of people have pointed out that liberal democracy itself may not be that stable, that there may be forces within liberalism that tend to undermine it. And, I think that in a way was the most powerful criticism. It doesn't mean that there's an obvious alternative. It doesn't mean that China is necessarily going to triumph, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, or any of the other systemic alternatives, but it may be that we'll just have this kind of incoherent world where there'll all be all these different kinds of regimes, and none of them, including liberal democracy, is actually going to be so dominant. And I would say that that's, the leading critique right now that I would take seriously.
Okay. So let me say a little bit about my own book, Nonzero. The title comes from game theory, the idea of a non-zero sum game. And part of the book was an argument about what was behind the growth in human social complexity since the hunter-gatherer days you mentioned. You do get this, at different rates in different areas and so on. There's a lot of variation, but you do wind up with agriculture being invented in a lot of places, and then you see correspondingly complex societies arise. You ultimately wind up, you get to empires and nation states, and then you get to a pretty globalized world eventually. And the argument was that one way to explain this was to say that new technologies arise, and this is an interesting difference between us. I mean, I focus on material forces. In that sense, at least, I'm closer to Marx, whereas you emphasize Hegel from the beginning in the essay itself, and associate yourself with a more, idealist in a Hegelian sense view of what drives history and the importance of ideas, consciousness, ideology. But anyway, so I see technological evolution as a real driver, and of course, human nature is behind that. I mean, we're an inventive species, and there are certain kinds of technologies we latch on to and spread. So in that sense, it's a reflection of human nature. But anyway, the idea is that as new technologies come along that facilitate or otherwise encourage the playing of non-zero-sum games involving more people over larger distances, you get a growth in the degree and scope of human social organization. That's certainly not to deny the importance of games that are closer to being zero-sum, like human conflict and competition. In fact, those are in important sense driving forces. But anyway, that's the basic argument. And then, so as for the what I envisioned for the future, let me actually read a. I get, as I said, relatively few criticisms because the book isn't as well known as yours. But I figured as this conversation was approaching, I Googled the one I remembered as most recent. Even this is more than a year ago, but it's by Samuel Hammond. You probably know him or of him. And I'll just read the quote. He's talking about how when we normalize trade relations with China at the end of the Clinton administration, how this turned out not to work out as well as we thought. He writes, quote, it was at any rate inevitable. That's kind of a reference to my book. The next sentence is, the logic of human destiny, as Robert Wright put it in the subtitle of his 1999 bestseller, Nonzero, showed, quote, win-win games between people and nations were in the driver's seat of human history, steering us toward a peaceful era of global interdependence. The book was a personal favorite of President Clinton's, but has since become a too perfect cultural artifact of the Whiggish ethos of the late 1990s. The only part I'd contest is the steering us toward a peaceful era of global interdependence. I emphasized, the culmination of history, in my view, was this continued growth of non-zero-sum dynamics would put nations in a more interdependent relationship. But I did say if they don't play their cards right and respond with especially certain forms of global governance to address non-zero-sum problems they commonly face, bioweapons was one I mentioned, climate change is another one, and so on. Now we might say AI, and there are others. But I emphasize that doom could ensue for sure. The jury was very much out on whether humankind would respond wisely to the growing non-zero sumness of history. So there, I feel better. That was very cathartic. That's my response.
Okay. I would just add a couple of things. First of all, you were modest in portraying your own book because you actually didn't start with hunter-gatherers. You started with, kind of one-cell organisms, and it was a kind of breathtaking argument, that actually you move from single cell to multicellular organisms of increasing complexity that are all solving these, zero-sum cooperation problems. And that's ultimately how you get to, down a very, very long road that extends over billions of years, that's how you get to human beings. And so the process of evolution didn't start with these primates in Africa. It really started, and I've never heard anyone make that argument before, but it's really kind of a brilliant one. And I think you should keep reminding people. Or I'll remind people.
Well, if you'll remind people of my genius, I'll remind them of yours. Yeah, it was. I mean, it's funny. I kind of tucked that part in the middle of the book. I began with kind of hunter-gatherer, life, and then described cultural evolutions unfolding in accordance with the logic of game theory in a certain sense. And then I paused, and for a few chapters, I started off with kind of self-replicating genetic material. And I think there are real kinds of commonalities. I think there are people who had made similar arguments without the game theory about the interplay of competition and cooperation. But yeah, I mean, I believe it was all I think getting to the point of a globalized, that you would get some intelligent species eventually, and it would go global. I think that was very, very likely. It's whether we play our cards wisely from here on out that I think wasn't necessarily likely, because I think the drivers behind all of this, as unlikely as it may sound, including the evolution of more complex and intelligent forms of life, I think the drivers have been very powerful.
Yeah. Well, I would say that there's one critique that would be common to both of our books, which is really the presupposition of rationality. And I must say that following both American and global politics over the last few years, I've really come to doubt, in many respects, basic human rationality. So solving a game theoretic problem assumes that you got a rational agent that's trying to maximize, over some kind of a utility function. And so the game theory simply says, how do you solve that, that problem? But what if the agent isn't actually rational? And this is the part that's actually very difficult. In a way, this started with the Iraq War. I turned against it, and all of my friends that had a very similar education and background and knew the same, details about the Middle East politics and military affairs all came to such different conclusions, and they're very certain about themselves. I actually have read a couple of books on the 20th anniversary of that war, especially this one by Robert Draper about how to start a war. And it brought back to me the things that I was thinking at that point. And it really has to do with what Jonathan Haidt calls motivated reasoning. That the people that were in favor of the war, like Paul Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby and the vice president and so forth, were they knew the result that they wanted in the beginning, and they basically used their really substantial cognitive abilities to defend that predetermined outcome. And there was no amount of actual empirical evidence that you could put in front of them that would change things. And I think that, we've seen that in American politics, recently, like, the rise of populism has a lot of people advocating things that are actually against their material self-interest, right? That you get all these kind of less educated whites in the South that wanted to get rid of Obamacare, even though they were among the biggest beneficiaries of Obamacare. So why is that the case? Well, it's because their partisan tribal loyalties came before any kind of real calculation of economic self-interest. And if you think about what are the big obstacles to the kind of global governance that you want, or that you would say would be rationally desirable for an intelligent species. It's the fact that we've got nations and we've got, national identities that are very self-contained and proud of themselves. And even though there's a clear material incentive to cooperate, they don't get there because they're not fully rational in that sense.
Yeah, I would say that I don't think hoping that humans will successfully play non-zero sum games depends entirely on the assumption that they'll be rational, although that would be nice. I mean, the history of non-zero sum social dynamics goes back so far in our biological lineage that we do a certain amount of it unconsciously. So if you ask, why are there the emotions that undergird friendship? Like somebody does a favor for you and you just like them, or you hear that they share a common interest. They criticize someone that you also don't like, and you kind of like them, right? And you're not thinking, oh, well, we have a common interest. We could pursue it jointly. We have a non-zero sum relationship, and we could overthrow the person we don't like. You don't have to think all that right away. The emotions like gratitude and a lot of these feelings were designed to get our ancestors to play non-zero sum games without necessarily thinking about it. That said, there are also emotions designed to support conflict in certain circumstances. And I think worse still is the fact that our environment now is so different from the environment that these emotions developed in, that we can't assume, to the extent that we might have with a hunter-gatherer society, that they will serve us well, that they will be proxies. They were designed as kind of proxy rational game theorists in a certain sense, and we can't assume very confidently that they will act like that now in an environment so different from the one they were designed for.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's you or some other evolutionary psychologists who said that human beings cooperate to compete, and they also compete to cooperate, and that's kind of been one of the big motors, right? That it's actually competition against other groups that has driven competition within the group. And therefore, although those emotions support that in-group competition, they also reinforce the out-group hostility and.
That I think that's fair. Different evolutionary psychologists, depending on how much they're in the group selectionist tradition, may differ in how they conceive the group. So I would think that a lot of the intergroup competition that shaped our psychology has come actually within social groups, has been coalitional infighting and not always physical fighting. It can be two groups arguing over who deserves what or who wronged whom. And I think that because that ultimately had Darwinian stakes, because it had to do with like who's going to get certain resources, that all of that shaped moral psychology. But yeah, so the two are certainly intertwined. And anyway, I think we all agree on many of the kinds of cognitive biases, the biases that can foment and sustain conflict between groups, and just delude us all into always thinking we're in the right. Yeah, even when we're defending our books. I mean, let's face it, somebody criticizes your book and you go through and with confirmation bias, you pick up on what seem like the most obviously wrong things. And sometimes you'll even skip the context that actually would weaken your complaint about that if you paid attention. It's all motivated reasoning. Let me ask you a question. To what extent has modern technology, I think modern technology that has come along since we wrote our books, has maybe challenged our theses in certain ways. I think of the big revolutions as being, well, since your book came out, the whole internet appeared really. In 92, nobody was talking about the internet when your book came out. The internet was part of my book and I talked about it, but it was before social media and it was before AI was a real thing. To what extent has that reshaped your thinking about the prospects for humankind?
Yeah, well, it's had a big effect. I mean, when the internet was first privatized in the mid 1990s, I and a lot of other people thought that this would be great for my argument, that it would help democracy because information was power. And if you spread information out more widely, more people would have power and they could take control of their lives and so forth. And that was the premise, because technology would be liberating. And it has been in many instances, but it turns out that it could also be very destructive. And I think what we've seen is, the technological elimination of a lot of middlemen. I remember back in the 1990s, people were saying, that's great. You don't need these gatekeepers. Everybody can be their own publisher. Well, turns out if everybody's their own publisher, there's no quality control.
Mhm.
Everybody's publishing whatever the hell they want, and there's really no hierarchy by which people can see what's more credible information and what's less. Forget about agreement on values, but just agreement on basic facts, like who won the last election, or is this vaccine safe? People can say whatever they want in this sphere, and they do, and it leads to this cognitive deterioration where the structures that have been put in place for the certification and validation of certain kinds of empirical knowledge about the world have been eroded. And this is a big problem. It's a little bit less of a problem in an authoritarian society because they can continue to reinforce those hierarchical structures. But in a democracy, it gets pretty destructive. And I'm not really sure, how we're going to see our way out of this.
Yeah, I should say you've been thinking about technology a long time. I remember in the 90s, maybe even late 80s, you organized a series of kind of evening seminars that you
Yeah, that's
invited
right.
me
At
to.
SAIS. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
when you were at School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, and if I got those words right, anyway,
Yeah, no,
SAIS,
that's right.
and um, I remember that's the first time I heard about this thing called Google. One of the seminars was somebody came in and said, I don't know if they were from Google or what, but it was like they have a new approach to search, and they did a new way of ranking websites, and that turned out to work out. But you've been thinking about this stuff a long time, and yet I don't. I think very few people could have envisioned what social media that social media would assume quite the form it did and have the effects it's had. I think in a way, my main concern is not so much with the qualitative nature of the change as with the velocity of it. It's like you need a certain amount of time to digest each change and adapt to it. And we haven't even really adapted to social media. I mean, we haven't figured out like the challenge of raising kids in a social media environment. And now comes AI, right? Uh,
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on that?
yeah. If you look at the history of the world since the Industrial Revolution, yeah, you're right that there's been this constant uh, burst of technological change, and then it takes societies a long time to figure out how to get it under control, right? So the printing press is the classical beginning point of this European destabilization that takes the Protestant Reformation and turns it into a European all-out war. And then finally, it takes another 150, 200 years to get that under control. Radio, television propel fascists, Stalinist dictatorships. And, again, there's a lot of Sturm and Drang before that's under control. And I think you're probably right that the rate of innovation, because we have a social system that produces innovation, that's dedicated to rapid innovation, the stuff is in many ways coming at us. I'm a little bit, I guess I'm a little bit of two minds, though, about the question of speed, because certainly in the digital world, things have moved very quickly. But there is this counter line of argument that actually the biggest technological changes actually occurred in this period from 1870 to about 1970. You think about electricity and the
Hmm.
difference that made, or indoor plumbing. My favorite is indoor plumbing. If you imagine a world without indoor
Yeah.
toilets, how awful that
Yeah, I
is.
also I also am a fan of indoor plumbing. I just want to sign on to that.
Yeah, okay. But that in certain ways, um, although the digital world has evolved very, very rapidly since 1970, we're still traveling on, jet airliners. We're still using ships to transport goods, railroads. We're driving around in cars. So that certain ways, the change has actually not been as rapid. And it's an interesting question whether, you know, what technology was doing in that period was just grabbing this low-hanging fruit, and that there will be further changes in the future. But they're
Hmm.
going to be hard. So I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion about that. But you're certainly right that the um, in the digital realm, the ability to adapt to new circumstances has been really foreshortened. I think the internet needs to be regulated, but we really haven't figured out how to do that. And until we do, I think we're going to be subject to these perpetual disruptions. Just over the horizon are deep fakes, that's going to destroy the credibility of every photograph, every video, that's
Yeah.
out there on the internet. And how do you deal with evidence in a court case, once that kind of manipulation becomes widespread? Yeah,
And
you
we
got big
may
problems.
develop ways to do that, and people are talking about them. It's just that it takes a while to implement each one. So if you're beset with a whole lot of challenges at once, I mean, like with AI, I've been thinking about this. If you imagine that these bots online say their goal is to foment political polarization in a country, or their goal is to recruit people to some new apocalyptic cult, whatever. They are actually having conversation with people. They seem like humans, and imagine that they are absorbing the conversational feedback they're getting and kind of the sign up rate or whatever, and adapting their own algorithms in keeping with that, and proliferating the successful algorithms. And so they're like evolving in real time to be more effective. It's going to take a little while to figure out what you do about that. Um,
Yeah.
I should say, AI is an example of the kind of thing I was talking about in my book. As I said, when I said, there's going to be more problems that can only be regulated at the international level. Climate change, bioweapons, which I think it kind of amazes me. We still, for all the talk about a lab leak, I haven't heard many people really grapple with the implications of that. Whether or not it was, it could have been. And even though it wasn't intentionally engineered as a bioweapon, it could have been. And that could have happened anywhere in any number of labs. There's no serious discussion of the kind of international regulation regime you'd need to control that. It's much more challenging than nuclear weapons. And AI shows signs of being more challenging still. And yet something that, again, I think needs to be regulated at the international level. I mean, if you imagine it evolving in a Cold War mindset where we're worried about what the Chinese are doing, they're worried about what we're doing, that's only going to accelerate, that's only going to work against regulation even at the national level. So anyway, this is my great concern. I'm curious what you think about that.
So,
I
so
also
actually, before you
Sure.
ask me that question, I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
I recall in Non-Zero, you had all these references to Teilhard de Chardin
Yeah.
and the idea that the internet could actually create something like a global mind that would actually not be fragmented into all of these competing, kind of evil nodes, but would actually develop something like a global consciousness. I mean, do you still believe that something like that is possible?
Well, I actually am. I want to write something called AI in the Noosphere. That was Teilhard de Chardin's term for it, the Noosphere, the thinking envelope of the Earth. Uh, Partly because the AI is turning out to be more of just a reflection of the pre-existing global brain than we thought. The way it just scans the text, human output to date, and then does it. So I haven't. I guess I'm starting to think that's kind of the sunny outcome is that maybe AI becomes a giant global brain, and we enter a symbiotic relationship with it and continue to be the ones who decide how we want it to behave. Right? I don't mean something highly centralized. I haven't really thought it through, but it's interesting that you should bring that up. Um, I don't know. What's your I have two questions, but first of all, just what's your reaction to what we've just said?
Yeah. Uh, well, I don't really see a global brain. I mean, I do think that the impact of AI is going to be more, conflictual in a certain sense. That it's going to empower, local actors that, can do various things. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. I thought one of the most interesting discussions you had in your book was the discussion about consciousness. That the question of whether consciousness arises. And I remember very distinctly, you took on a lot of the people, the neuroscientists that had written about consciousness. And, a lot of them have this idea that consciousness arises just when the density of the neurons gets to a certain point, right? So brain is just a wet computer. It's much more complex than any existing computer. But once the dry computers get to that point, you're going to see things like emotions and subjective feelings and so forth arise. And as I recall, you were very skeptical, that we didn't really understand that transition and whether that could actually happen. But certainly that is relevant to the question of whether there will be something like a global brain.
Yeah, I guess I do think consciousness is quite mysterious, and one reason is although I'm willing to accept that the kind of epiphenomenal view is a real possibility. That is to say, it just arises out of the physical workings and has no independent causal force, right, on those workings. But that just raises the question of why it's here. That would mean it has no evolutionary function. And it only begins to influence things at all once you and I start talking about it. Once you get creatures with language that start to report their subjective states, that could support, well, it could in a way support a teleological view of history if its function only emerges long after it first shows up. But and as you know, I'm more open to teleological interpretations of history than many. But there's a consciousness question I have for you. At least it involves the same word, even though it's a very different kind of question. Do you want to elaborate on the sense in which you identify with Hegel's emphasis on kind of consciousness and ideas as maybe not entirely autonomous in their, influence on the world? They respond to material forces, but it's always a hard thing for me to think about it all. Well, like which is on top? Obviously, material world influences ideas. Ideas influence the material world. Um, what does it mean to emphasize the side of it that you emphasize?
Well, I just think it means that you have a more complicated view of historical change. I think that, yeah, I mean, since I've become an academic, I had to deal with all these rational choice political scientists who think that everything is just a matter of material self-interest and rational agents that are dealing with it. And I keep saying, ideas are also important. I'm not denying that people respond to material incentives and organize their societies to maximize that in a certain sense, but there are other phenomena that you just cannot explain without reference to ideas. So for example, the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther taxed these 95 theses on the cathedral door, and a lot of things begin to happen. Is there a simple material explanation for why that took place? Well, okay, the Germany at that time was ready for a social revolution, but there had been social revolutions before and after, and there's something about the way that Luther made his arguments that was particularly mobilizing and catalyzed a lot of people into action. And you can't really explain subsequent developments if you don't actually see ideas as a kind of autonomous realm that develop kind of in parallel with the development of material things. So I tried to explain this in my identity book, that in a way Luther has this impact on contemporary identity politics because he had this idea that there's an inside and an outside, and the true Christian believer is one whose inner self has faith in God, and it doesn't matter what any of your external behaviors or beliefs, are. and that gets secularized, by someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who says it's really that inner feeling of existence that's the authentic self, and all of the social conventions are meaningless. And this then leads us to this modern sense of identity, where we believe that we have this inner hidden being that's the true, authentic, real us, and the society is forcing us to conform in all of these different ways. And you know I just don't see these as a product necessarily. They're influenced by material events, but if you don't actually listen to the conversation that these thinkers have with one another, and how you take this Protestant idea of the inner self and then you give it a secular form, that has a big impact on the outside world. So I was never arguing against any of the materialist. In fact, what I said in the end of history is that there are these two drivers that operate in parallel. There's a material driver that had to do with production techniques and the nature of the economy in any given period. But there's also a parallel evolution of human consciousness, and the two interact. Causality runs in both directions, but they are separate drivers of history.
So you would acknowledge, for example, to stick with the Reformation, that the printing press was very likely to pose a kind of challenge to the Catholic Church, which had previously exerted kind of monopoly on written information because they had the monks, and monks did the writing. But it was, and maybe it was even close to inevitable that this would result in certain groups whose interests hadn't been indulged by the church, that it would lead groups like that to engage, to give some kind of pushback, maybe some rebellion. But then it certainly wasn't inevitable that it would be a guy whose big thing was faith, not works, right? And now I suppose and he had various other eccentricities. I mean, he was anti-Semitic. He had all kinds of baggage that he brought with it that you wouldn't say flowed inevitably from the printing press.
Yeah.
But
that's exactly it.
Yeah.
If Karl Marx had not been born, would you have had the kinds of communist revolutions that then characterize the next 150 years of human history? You had all these preceding socialists like Lassalle, and I mean, you kind of learn the history of this when you learn 19th century European history, but somehow Marx managed to put it in this way that convinced everybody that this was truly scientific, as opposed to all these unscientific forms of socialism. And a lot of people wanted to believe that, and the idea caught on, and it really had to do in a way with the ability to shape ideas in these complex, persuasive ways that really give them force. And again, that's not something you can simply explain as a result of the social conditions or economic conditions.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, in a way, the question is how big a swath do you carve out for contingency? And I would say, even in my worldview, a very big one. I mean, I wouldn't say something like the Soviet Union, that whole period, was anything like inevitable. I do think globalization was pretty close to inevitable, assuming we didn't get hit by an asteroid or something. And the kinds of choices it faces us with generically, like either cross the threshold into a true global community that solves critical joint problems together, or pay the price. Beyond that, and of course, it's beyond that our lived lives largely, that's where we live, right? It's like you and I lived through the Cold War. We remembered a lot more clearly than some younger people, and it was formative and definitive. And it's a reason I'm not curious. I'm not eager to return to another one. It's one reason. What are your thoughts on that, by the way? Well, let's take. See, this is an interesting thing to me. Is I would think that your argument in the end of history. You already mentioned that you would never have ruled out the triumph of something like China, but and I should acknowledge that although I didn't predict the triumph of liberal democracy, I did. I think market economics are more efficient than a command economy, and you would see more economic engagement. And I thought that, leaving aside the question of whether China becomes a democracy, I thought that especially digital technology would pose the leadership there and other places with a choice between continued kind of authoritarian autocratic control and prosperity. In other words, if you give people the kind of freedom you need to harness these technologies in the name of prosperity, that at least tends to have a politically pluralizing effect. So I did say that, and I admit that China has done well, especially the current regime, a better job than I might have predicted of, even in the age of the internet, kind of keeping things under control, so to speak. So I have a little bit of a mea culpa there, maybe, but certainly with your argument, I think the naive reader at least would think contemporary China is a big threat. And if for that matter, if Russia, if Putin-esque Russia becomes this huge force, which actually doesn't seem that likely right now, but that's a challenge. What do you don't want to make any predictions about the future of China?
No, I don't want to make a prediction, but you may still be right in that original view, because what Xi Jinping is doing right now is actually deconstructing the competitive market economy that China's current prosperity really depends on. And so I think it's still the case that competitive market economies do better than centrally planned ones. And he is shifting China back to that earlier model for really reasons that I find hard to fathom, but it is going to have a big impact on China's ability to continue to grow. And it's really their growth that has allowed them to avoid all of the social tensions that would build up when you have this degree and rapidity of social change. They're constant. In fact, there's just a piece that I read this morning about the unemployment rate among college graduates in China is now approaching it's well over 20%. And what's that going to do to the stability of the system if this, continues to deepen and, you really get economic stagnation? So you still may be right about the relationship between, a certain kind of political freedom and the ability to maintain a kind of sustainable, growing economic system.
Yeah, I would think if you ask why he's done this, it's because he fears that there is a connection. I mean, certainly when he tried to marginalize some of the big capitalist players, it was because he saw them maybe as a political threat, but that's not exactly what I have in mind. But in any event, I agree with you. The jury's out on whether he can reconcile prosperity with extremely firm centralized political control. So do you, anyway, I was going to ask you, about this Cold War thing, which concerns me greatly, where we seem to be heading. Are you concerned? You're probably more of a hawk than I am. Maybe both Russia hawk and China hawk. I don't know. But what's your take on all this?
Yeah, I'm definitely more hawkish than you.
Oh, so you've kept track of my Twitter output?
Yes. Well, that's what social media does. It allows you to follow a lot of people simultaneously. Yeah, I mean, especially with Ukraine, I personally and my center has done a lot of work in Ukraine ever since 2014. And we have lots and lots of Ukrainian friends. And, at one point, they captured a list of people that the Russians tried to take Kyiv in last February, March, and then they had to withdraw. And so they actually got a lot of captured Russian documents, and they actually had lists of all the people that they would have arrested if they had succeeded in taking the capital. And, a lot of our people were on it, and so it just seems to me that the moral cost of, this kind of aggression is going to be a really high one. So I've been very supportive of Ukraine. I mean, that's a whole separate discussion that we can get into about, the military situation and moral justifications and so forth. China, I think, is going to be a big problem, because I do think that, any power that rises that quickly and gets that big is simply historically has always been a big problem for international systems to handle. And I guess the one thing that makes me a little bit less concerned is that Xi Jinping seems to be much less of a risk taker than Putin. I mean, Putin's just off the charts in terms of the stuff that he's willing to risk. I wrote my PhD dissertation actually on Soviet policy in the Middle East, and the basic thesis was that they would threaten to intervene, but they actually never did it. They'd always threaten after the peak of the crisis when they knew that they wouldn't have to carry through on the threat. So they're actually extremely cautious. They never introduced their own forces into the region or really any other region. Putin has just shot all that to hell. He's put troops in Syria and Venezuela, and
Well, Syria, but I mean, we probably shouldn't get too much into the nuts and bolts. He was invited in by the Syrian government. That's not like us invading Iraq.
But the Soviet Union was invited in too during the Cold War, and they just never agreed to do that. So there's just a level of risk taking in his case that has also, I think, been very self-destructive, because he's taken these really crazy risks, the biggest one being invading Ukraine, and he's now paying a huge price, and that society is going to pay a continuing price, I think, really for generations.
Yeah, I think he's gotten less risk averse with time. And, I'm very, the invasion was a clear-cut violation of international law. I condemn it along with everyone else. The reason, one thing that shapes my whole reaction to it is my sad recognition that the U.S. has been a flagrant violator of international law. And for that reason, I think, in terms, it's not as if, I worry about the risks associated with trying to push Russia all the way out of Ukraine, just in terms of likelihood of nuclear war. But I also worry that it will not have nearly as much positive effect in terms of reinforcing the norm of respecting international law as it would have had if we had ourselves respected it. But I want to ask you, I also have this view that we kind of misplayed our hand over the last 25 years, and we could be living in a very different world that didn't have a Ukraine war if we hadn't. And I think that I want to ask you if you don't agree with some of that, because I remember, there was a conversation, this podcast, Nonzero, was previously I started this thing called, co-founded this thing called Blogging Heads TV. It kind of evolved into this. I remember a conversation on that platform between you and Bob Kagan, and you were predicting at that point that what we had done in Kosovo, not just the military intervention, but we had just, I think, started to recognize Kosovo's independence. And by the way, that was, I think most people would say, an illegal violation of international law, that intervention, at least I and a lot of people would say that. And you predicted that Putin would, exploit that, or that would make it more likely that he would start screwing around in Georgia, which he subsequently did. So I want to ask you, were you a critic of some of our early Russia policy, including NATO expansion, or not?
Well, look, I know you interviewed John Mearsheimer. John is an old friend and colleague of mine, but I think he's just been completely wrong, and he's been playing a very, very unhelpful role ever since the Russian invasion started. I was not in favor of taking Georgia and Ukraine into NATO back in 2008 when Bush administration pushed that.
Okay.
It wasn't for the reasons, however, that John cites. It was really because I thought that, I started out as a military analyst at the RAND Corporation, and one of the things you know is that you can't support a military operation if you don't have the right military logistics. And it just seemed to me that it would be very, very difficult to actually defend Georgia and Ukraine. And Ukraine, at that time being, divided between a Russian-speaking East and a more Ukrainian West. Actually, right now, I'm completely in favor of taking Ukraine into NATO. I don't see how you're going to end this war if Ukraine doesn't actually become a member of NATO. But I think that the problem I had with Mearsheimer's argument is that he's completely oblivious to what Putin is actually saying. And of course, Putin has complained about NATO expansion and so forth, but the deeper arguments are so much broader than that. He thinks that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a huge tragedy. He thinks that the Slavic peoples, really have a destiny that includes the domination of all the weaker countries around him, and that was not driven by any kind of threat, from what's essentially a defensive alliance. It comes from his understanding of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, and you know Russia's destiny as a Eurasian power. And so I think that yeah, so I just think that there are so many other drivers of what Putin ended up doing, that NATO expansion, it was imprudent. It gave him a good excuse. I guess this is the way I would put it. It gave him an excuse to do what he wanted to do anyhow, that has now become persuasive among a certain audience in the West, and therefore has weakened, the Western uh, 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 support for Ukraine. But I would agree with you that we made a lot of mistakes. I mean, the invasion of Iraq was a huge mistake. I think that one of the reasons that that Ukraine hasn't gotten as much support in the global South that we, or people like me, think it deserves is because of Iraq. Certainly in the Arab world, I've had Arab friends tell me that, look, you did the same thing in 2003, so why are we supposed to get so excited about Ukraine when you did it yourself? Now, I do believe that you can make both a moral and a political argument why these are two very different cases. Iraq was a really rapacious dictatorship, and Ukraine is a pretty good democracy. But I can appreciate the point that in terms of crossing international borders with military force, that was a terrible precedent we set, and we've made certainly many other mistakes especially in the Middle East, because I just think that we don't know what we're doing in that region. That have weakened our position. But Vietnam was a mistake too. I mean,
there have been a lot of mistakes. Yeah. Well, I don't want to. I mean, I kind of think Putin's the worldview you described has, to some extent, evolved more than we appreciate. And the things he's saying that seem to go so far beyond a Mearsheimer world of just national security as a motivation, I think kind of got a lot more pronounced and crystallized, I think, in response to his perception that we kept keeping disrespect on him. But that's another argument there. I mean, it goes beyond NATO expansion in terms of the things he was unhappy with. But all that's a much longer conversation. I know you got to go at the top of the hour. So I wanted to ask you, I wanted to get back to technology and ask, we kind of touched on this a little, but it's relevant to the future of liberal democracy. I mean, is it possible that information technologies, including social media, including AI, are so potentially destabilizing that a more authoritarian and autocratic country has more of a competitive advantage than they would have had 30 years ago, just because they're going to be better able to crack down, keep that stuff under control, and keep it from destabilizing their societies?
Well, it's possible that will work in certain domains, but whether that becomes a sustainable system is really questionable. The thing about authoritarian regimes is that when you're sitting on top of a society that's kind of a boiling cauldron, and a lot of changes are happening, and social conditions are changing very rapidly, you're trying to control that in a top-down manner simply through repression. And I think what we've seen repeatedly is that kind of regime looks really strong until the moment it collapses. And a lot of times you can't predict when that moment is going to hit, but it hits eventually because the nature of social change just outruns the ability to control. I mean, one of the really fascinating things that's going on in the Middle East right now is that these autocracies in the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Qatar, are educating women at incredible rates. I mean, most of those countries graduate, 60% of their college graduates or more are female. How long are those regimes going to maintain that kind of patriarchal control when, you know, half of your society is much better educated than the other
Yeah.
half, you know? So they've done a pretty good job at maintaining stability up till now, but without fundamentally adjusting, I think they're head. And the stuff that's gone on in after Masa Amini's killing in Iran is a sign of this. So the regime has held on by the skin of its teeth, but it has deeply, deeply delegitimized itself in many ways. And how it's going to survive the next 30 years, it's very questionable.
Yeah, and I mean, China has its own things. You mentioned some, but it has like a surplus of males owing to selective abortion that
Yeah.
was in turn a consequence of the one-child policy, and that can be a destabilizing thing in a society. So yeah, there's a lot of question marks out there. Well, listen, thanks so much for taking the time, Frank. I think in closing, we can agree that both of us deserve a lot of respect and should be, I think, pretty close to immune to criticism. Would you? Would you support it?
I would jail all the people that actually really criticize us openly.
In your ideal liberal democracy, they would all be in prison. Is that?
Yes, they'd all be in prison.
That would be the end of history.
Yeah,
I'm with you there. I'm with you there. Well,
okay.
Thanks so much, Frank. Great talking to you.
Okay, yeah, same here, Bob.